Chapter 4. We didn't go back to the cave after that day. Blade didn't talk about it. He didn't talk about anything. He grew sullen and quiet, and most of our time was spent sitting in silence. We sat in the gardens and watched the butterflies dance among the colorful blooms. Summer was passing quickly. The approaching school year seemed mundane and boring compared to the time I spent with Blade, and I thought about it with less dread than the previous years. The other kids didn't seem to matter anymore. Blade sat staring at the entrance to the maze, barely blinking. I got the feeling he wasn't really there, and he was traveling in some land far beyond my comprehension. Every day I waited for him to return. He would sit motionless for hours before suddenly turning to look at me with dazed eyes and ask me the time. It was always 4:45, and he would get up and leave without another word. Sometimes I sat for a while after he left and stared at the maze, trying to see whatever it was Blade saw. No matter how long I sat there, Valencia was always in the window of the library when I turned to leave. The glass had been repaired, and she stood there each day watching me and muttering to herself. I could see her lips moving and her hands moved in front of her, creating large shapes in the air. Thin strands of hair fell into her eyes, but she continued to sign and mutter without brushing them away. The days continued the same. They began to blur together into one long, boring, and anxious day. One morning, Blade began acting strangely. He jumped up and paced around in front of the maze before returning to stare at the entrance. He left early that day. Unable to sit still any longer, he made a quick excuse and left me. I watched him walk away and noticed that he was limping. Valencia was watching him as well, and muttering and gesturing wildly. Blade turned at the edge of the forest and gave me a large smile. It was wild and manic, and I was frightened. I followed his gaze to the library window. Valencia stood frozen in mid-gesture with her hands held high above her head. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, and then she crumpled out of sight. I ran to her, certain as my feet pounded up the stairs that she would be gone by the time I reached her. I threw myself full force into the library door and burst in to see her body thrashing around violently. It stiffened and lifted up off the floor. I threw myself on top of her and pinned her down. She immediately went limp, coughed, and was still. Her expression was dazed, and she rubbed her temples slowly, like she did when she was about to have a migraine. Finally, she seemed to recognize me. She sat up slowly. "Casey?" She went limp again, but I caught her and held her up as best I could. As she leaned against me, I could feel the twig-like bones of her arms. She seemed so feeble and defenseless. I held her until she was able to stand. She leaned heavily on me, and we walked slowly to a particularly dusty shelf of books, where she pulled out a gray volume with the word Doomavine printed down the side in gold letters. There was a soft, almost inaudible click, and the shelves swung back, revealing a dark passageway. We entered the darkness and the door clicked shut behind us. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light. It came from far down the passage, and we began to shuffle slowly toward its origin. As the light grew brighter, Valencia's steps grew stronger, and we were able to move more quickly. The source of the light was obvious the moment we stepped into the room. There was a swirling vortex of golden light hovering in the middle of the large space. The walls were covered in heavy draperies, each filled with small, intricate pictures and designs that shimmered and moved on their own. In a far corner was a tremendous bookcase filled with stacks of ancient books. Placed next to the bookcase was a small black sofa, where Valencia sat down, her head resting against a plush velvet pillow. She indicated to an overstuffed maroon chair, and I sank into it slowly. My eyes were trying to take in the whole room at once. "What do you think?" Valencia's voice made me turn toward her in surprise. The rasp and crackle were gone, and she seemed vibrant and alive. She was smiling at me. Her face was young and her wrinkles smoothed away. Her hair was thick, dark, and glossy, instead of her usual tangled ball of gray frizz. I stared at her, speechless and confused, and she laughed. It was loud and clear as a bell. "So now you see that the rumors are true. I am indeed a witch. The last witch of Norg Hollow but one, to be exact. I wish I could have told you sooner. I am sorry you have suffered, Casey. But it is our curse. Humans can always sense when someone is different, even if the person is not aware of it themselves." I was aware of it, I said bitterly. The isolation of the past 10 years came flooding back. The taunts and the cruelty were sharp and still hurt me deeply. Valencia must have seen it on my face because she sighed and tapped her fingers on the sofa. I wanted to tell you sooner, but I could not. Your education could not begin until you came of age. Until then it had to be kept a secret. It was the only way to keep you safe. Safe from what? All in good time, dear. We will have a good long talk tonight. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. First of all, have you seen any sizzles? I looked at her blankly, and she laughed. I'm sorry. I forgot you do not yet know the terminology. Sizzles are the beginnings of magic. It can be anything from unexplained powers or sensations to even seeing strange beasts or phantom lights. Yes, I've seen them. Good. That means you're ready. We talked through the night. Dawn was breaking over the treetops as I emerged from the passage into the library. I crossed to the desk and picked up a book. My head was spinning as I tried to process all the new information. I should have been tired, but I felt the way I had the first time I tried Valencia's espresso. Objects in the room looked sharp and defined, and it was like I was seeing everything for the first time. I went to the window and looked out across the maze. From the library, the maze stretched out far into the distance. The hedges created a beautiful shape, spiraling out from the center. I wondered where the lion fountain lay in that huge labyrinth. A flutter of movement turned my eye from the maze, and I saw Blade emerge from the forest. He saw me, and I slowly raised my hand in greeting. He stared back at me with a blank expression. I turned and started slowly toward the door. I did not run to meet him. Valencia's words came back to me. She had spoken again of the Raskies and their once mighty leader. She believed Blade to be half of the great Rasky, brought down centuries before by a powerful witch from Norg Hollow. Which half, the good or the bad, she didn't know, and it became my task to find out. I was afraid as I moved toward him. He watched me with the same blank expression. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his jeans, and his shoulders were hunched against the cold mist of early morning. He held his hand out to me as I approached, and I took it and followed him into the forest. He led me down a path I had never noticed before. We slipped through a thin opening between two huge oaks and followed a path lined with large moss-covered rocks. Tiny white and orange flowers speckled the vibrant green, and the trees grew close and were intertwined in a tight canopy overhead. The path was dark. I stumbled against Blade. My heart jumped into my throat every time we touched. I heard the water before we came to it. The path ended abruptly on the bank of a clear, bubbling brook. To one side was a bench that had been carved out of a fallen tree, and a picnic was spread on a small open space beside it. Blade sat me on the bench and brought me a gorgeous breakfast of fruit and bread. There was more of his mom's apple wine. I sipped at it cautiously and remembered Valencia's warning words. Blade was as happy that morning as when we first met. He was talkative and laughed easily. After breakfast, he held my hand and watched the flowing water at our feet. I'd like you to meet my family, Casey. Really? My heart pounded nervously, but I couldn't tell if it was from fear or his gentle smile. Yeah. My mom keeps asking me when you're going to come over, and I've told my sister all about you. I really like you, Casey. I know they will too. He squeezed my hand and leaned in to kiss me. His lips were soft and sweet. I couldn't resist the curiosity that burned inside me. I wanted to meet his family, and when we finally parted, I agreed to meet them sometime that week. The idea made me nervous. Even after everything Valencia had told me, I still wanted them to like me. Valencia was worried when I told her. She had taken on her elderly persona and was sitting hunched over in a rocking chair in the living room. A large shawl was drawn around her thin shoulders, though the day was very warm. My head was swimming. Love and magic and danger were all struggling to be in the forefront of my mind. I soothed Valencia's nerves as best I could and went outside to walk and think. I was just rounding a bend in the drive when I saw Blade. Without knowing why, I quickly ducked behind a tree. He looked around suspiciously before moving into the trees. I hurried to the spot where he had entered the forest, keeping low in case he turned around. Just beyond the tree line there was a path, and I followed Blade quietly, close enough to keep sight of him, but far enough behind to give me time to hide if he suddenly turned back. He didn't turn around once, but moved purposefully down the path. He moved quickly, and I hurried to keep up. Then I stumbled over a root and rolled into some bushes. Blade froze. "Is someone there? Evelyn?" He waited a moment longer before he continued his confident stride. I wondered who Evelyn was as I crawled back onto the path and continued after him. I bent at the waist and moved quickly through the deepening darkness. I came upon him suddenly and had to dive into the underbrush to avoid being seen. He knelt before a tall piece of black rock, a giant slab that lay propped against the rocky mountainside like an ancient toppled gravestone. He rested his forehead against the polished rock, and I could see his lips moving. At first I could not hear the words from my hiding place among the sticks and brush, but as I watched, he began to speak louder, chanting in a strange tongue. His hand was hidden under his jacket, a heavy wool jacket that seemed strange in the oppressive August heat. His chanting turned into a scream. The sound was maddening until he stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, he slowly withdrew his hand from his jacket. Held lightly in his strong brown hand was a small bird. Tufts of gray and white feathers peeked out from between his fingers. The bird looked quietly at Blade. It turned its inquisitive face to him without fear. I could see his fingers tightening around its little body. The bird began to thrash, and a squeal escaped it that was unlike any sound I'd ever heard. I covered my ears, but I couldn't drown it out. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the thrashing animal until there was a cracking sound, and the bird fell silent. Blade removed a long, thin knife from his pocket and laid the bird at the foot of the stone. He slid it open and laid the entrails on the ground. He took his blood-smeared hands and ran them over the stone. The blood glowed before vanishing into the rock. The surface of the stone began to ripple. He placed his hands against it, and they disappeared. His body melted into the stone, and he was gone. I ran to the rock, but it was hard and cold under my hands. The bird's body had vanished, and I stood where it had been, wondering what to do next. There was a rustle in the trees, and I turned to find Blade's sister staring at me. I jumped back, but she smiled sweetly. "Hello. My name's Evelyn. What's yours?" "I'm Casey." "You're my brother's friend. Have you seen him? I was following him, but he got away." "I haven't seen him." She knew I was lying. I could see it in her face, but she just shrugged. "Oh well, I guess I'll just go help Mom make cookies. Do you like cookies?" "Sure." "Well, it was nice to meet you, Evelyn. I should really go." "Mom's making chocolate chip cookies," she said sweetly. "They're my favorite." "That sounds good. I really need to get back to my house now." I started slowly backing down the path. "To help your grandma?" "Yeah." "Blade told me she's a witch. Is that true?" "That's a rumor the other kids started. She's just old." "Are you sure? It'd be a lot more interesting if she was a witch." "I'm sure. Look, Evelyn, I really need to get back." She shrugged. "Okay, bye." She sat down at the base of the rock and began drawing in the dirt. The cookies were forgotten, and she was singing to herself as I started down the path. Once out of sight, I began to run. I went as fast as I could, stumbling over roots and rocks until I found the driveway. I kept running all the way back to the house. My heart was pounding by the time I reached the front door. I threw it open and collapsed just inside. I lay there trying to catch my breath and waiting for my heartbeat to slow down. That's how Valencia found me. She dropped the elderly persona immediately and rushed to my side. I sat up quickly to show her that I was all right, and she helped me to my feet. We went upstairs to the library. Valencia left me to get a glass of water, and when she returned, I told her everything I'd seen. She listened to my story in silence. When I stopped speaking, she stood and paced the room with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "This worries me, Casey. I think we have found Gredick. Or rather, he found you. I wonder if the sister is the other half. How did she seem?" "I don't know. She talked kind of funny, but she's just a little kid. She was really sweet and friendly." "Maybe she's the good half." Valencia sat behind her desk and fell silent. I waited for her to say more. She looked up at the ceiling and drummed her fingers on the desktop for a moment before jumping up and going to the door of the secret passage. "I need some time to consider this. I will speak with you later." She stepped into the passage and was gone without another word. I went to the window and looked out. Evening was approaching. I stood facing west, watching the very first wisps of sunset appear in the sky. It was beautiful, and I felt much better with my back turned to the east. I watched the sky turn bright pink and then slowly fade into the coolness of dusk. Dusk turned to night, and I finally turned away from the window. The secret door swung open minutes later, and Valencia entered the room. She motioned to me, and I followed her wordlessly into the passage. The hidden room was filled with candles. The golden swirling light was gone, and the room was cozier in the dim candlelight. I settled myself on the sofa, and Valencia poured me a glass of iced tea. "I have a tale to tell you, Casey. It's not something I ever wanted you to hear, for it reflects badly on me, but I think it will help you understand." She paused for a moment. Her face was thoughtful and a little sad. There was shame there, and regret, something I had never seen on her face before. "I am old, Casey. Far older than I seem to humans. 428 years in their reckoning. Yet I was once a young and pretty witch, more interested in my own beauty and the strength of my magic than anything else. Men flocked to me, and I liked showing off my powers. It was dangerous to do so. If only I'd known then how dangerous it was. The human race is not kind to those who are different, but I flaunted my powers anyway. Some men feared me. Some wanted to use me to their advantage. None of them loved me. That was all I wanted, all I thought about in those days. I met Christopher during the height of my vanity. It seems so long ago." She sighed. Her eyes were sad, but a little smile remained on her lips as she continued. "He was so handsome. I'll never forget the first time I saw him. It was at a ball. Times were different then. He was dressed in mourning clothes, black from head to toe. When I asked him who had passed, he gave me a cunning smile and said, 'No one.' I knew there was something special about him then. His outer appearance was that of a gentleman, and a rather boring one at that, but his true self was something far more complex and mysterious. I think I fell in love with him at that very moment, and I have loved him ever since." Her hands shook, spilling a little of her tea into her lap, but she didn't notice. A tear slid down her cheek, followed by another, then 2 more. Then she stopped. Those 4 drops were the only tears I ever saw her shed over Christopher, though we would talk about him constantly in the weeks to follow. I sipped at my tea and waited for her to continue. I knew how she felt. As she spoke, my thoughts drifted to Blade and his mischievous smile. I was just beginning to understand how it felt to be in love. Valencia must have seen this reflected in my face, and when she next spoke, her voice was strong once more, the loss and longing replaced by a more mechanical recitation. "Love is a blinding force. It can close your eyes to many things, many faults in a person that should not be ignored. I was fortunate that Christopher had very few. He was a kind soul, intelligent and generous, and I was proud to have him love me. We were married for 46 years, and they were the happiest of my long life. I bore him 2 children, twins, a girl and a boy. Your Uncle Maven has spent the past 80 years in the magical realm, trying to unite the sorcerers of Greys and bring them to our aid. The time is drawing near, and we will need all the help we can find. But it still may not be enough. But I am getting off topic, and you must be confused. Where was I? Oh yes. After I gave birth to Clara and Maven, I had to tell Christopher the truth. He was the only man from whom I had kept my true identity. I was so scared that he wouldn't love me if he knew. There were a few rumors, of course, but I always made light of them and didn't think he suspected a thing. I was shocked to find out that he already knew. He was a sorcerer from Greys, a Deku, the most powerful of them all. That was his true self, the thing I sensed immediately upon meeting him. We were both different, and somehow we had found each other. Life was very happy after that. We only disguised ourselves in public, and the kids knew to never tell a soul about our true identities. It was a wonderful period of time. Everything was so good, and we were all so happy. If I were human, it would have been almost my entire life. That's their blessing and their curse. If they're lucky, their brief lives are filled with love and happiness. Christopher wasn't human, but his life was that way, short and happy. That was the only thing that made his death bearable for me. The thought that he lived his whole life in love and joy. I tried to think of it like that, but most of the time I just felt robbed. I should have had him for a true lifetime. I lost centuries. It wasn't fair. I still have a hard time thinking about it. I'm sorry. This time Valencia just wrapped her arms around herself and trembled. The sorrow she felt was tearing her apart, and had been for many, many years. I reached over and rubbed her bony shoulders. The shaking slowly subsided, and she was able to speak once more. She poured a new cup of tea and smiled at me. This is a long tale to end such a long day, but I am coming to my conclusion if you will be patient with me. I agreed, and we settled back into our seats. The day Christopher died, he was mixing a potion he had made 1,000,000 times before. It was a simple elixir for baldness, for he could never stand to lose his beautiful hair. Something went wrong, and the mixture exploded. The house was vaporized. There was nothing but a pile of ash when I returned from the market. I just stood there for a while. I dropped my disguise, and I just stood there, honest and true. Thank goodness the children were grown and gone by then. I don't know how long I would have stayed like that if Sparks hadn't shown up. He was Christopher's best friend from childhood, another sorcerer of Gray's. His talents were mostly in shape-changing and herb lore, but he was strong. His powers rivaled Christopher's, and they had been competing with each other since infancy. I wasn't surprised to see him there, though I should have been. Sparks hadn't been around for over 30 years at that point. He lived in a house on our property before then, a small wooden box tucked behind a grove of trees on the southern lawn. He lived there for years, until he and Christopher had an argument. It was an explosive interaction that made me glad we lived in the country and had no nearby neighbors. I watched from our bedroom window as Sparks stormed away from the house. He turned once and looked straight at me. His expression was something that has haunted me ever since. Every emotion was present on his face. Passion and pain danced a perilous duet across his handsome features. I didn't see him again until the day Christopher died, but I wasn't surprised when he reappeared. Sparks had the uncanny ability to be present wherever people suffered most. He enjoyed it, fed off it, and I was angered to see his brooding face looking at me over the remains of my happiness. I'm getting close to the end of my tale, so I will hurry things along. Sparks supported me after Christopher died, and I grew to love him. He was a very passionate man, quick to love and quick to rage. My life was tumultuous during that time, and we parted when I couldn't take his anger any longer. It was bad when I left. Really bad. He hurt me, but I managed to escape. I went into hiding in a cave in the frozen north. I focused on improving my skills as a witch. Happiness and then the tumult of life had made me forget so much of my earlier training at Norg Hollow, and I studied for many long and lonely years. If it hadn't been for Sparks, I may never have studied hard enough to become who I am today. I owe him that much, I suppose. In my studies, I stumbled onto the tale of the Raskies and the demise of their king at the hands of a witch. When he split, part of his energy became attached to the witch and haunted her throughout her life. She and her children could not escape him. It was passed down through the generations of witches. The most powerful of the Norg Hollow witches are all cursed with this attachment. Many have done desperate things to separate themselves from the Rasky, but none have ever succeeded. The Rasky always returns, always at a significant time in the lives of these witches, and he will always return until every witch is dead or someone is strong enough to stop him. Valencia stopped speaking. She looked concerned, but I motioned eagerly for her to continue. She sighed, gave me one more apprehensive look, and finished her story. I sat for a long time after she told me. The brave foremother, the witch who fought a god and brought him to a mere shadow of his old power, was Valencia's grandmother. I was her descendant, the last witch of Norg Hollow, or I would be once I finished my training. The Rasky would come to me, and I would battle him. But where or when, Valencia could not say. She continued by saying that she now believed Sparks had been part of the Rasky. His powers had been far greater than she had known. Their fight before she left him had proved that, and she was lucky to have survived. She believed he had done something to cause Christopher's death, as well as all the other suffering that seemed to follow in his wake. She said nothing else and left me alone to think in silence. But she had already planted the seed. The Rasky that would come to me during a significant time in my life, my coming of age, and the beginning of my training. It all seemed to connect to Blade's strange behaviors and moods. I turned it over in my mind again and again, unable to believe that I could love a being of pure evil. I cried for a long time that night. Eventually I was too exhausted to continue and collapsed on the sofa. My sleep was tormented by dreams of Blade and evil spirits and monstrous men. I awoke at dawn, more exhausted than when I had gone to sleep, and made my way into the library. Blade was waiting for me on the lawn below, and I staggered out into the morning sun to meet him. Chapter 5. A few days later, Blade asked me to meet his sister. I thought he gave me an odd look as he spoke, but I remained silent. I didn't want him to know I'd been following him, and I hoped that Evelyn would keep quiet about our previous encounter. He took my hand as we walked slowly down the drive through the hazy, early morning sunlight. The air was already thick and hot. The day was going to be a scorcher. Blade was talking about a video he'd seen that morning. It was something stupid, like a singing cat or something. I listened, but I wasn't really interested. Valencia had a phobia of technology, and computers in particular. I used to think it was senility, but with my new information, I now had to wonder at her real reason for the technological blackout. I decided to ask her when I got home. I'd seen the internet at school, and I was pretty proficient with computers, but I wasn't obsessed the way most kids my age seemed to be. Blade certainly was. He rambled on about different videos all the way to his house. Not that I minded. He was happy. There was a look on his face that made me smile, and his voice was alive and excited. I loved being with him when he was like this. Even with everything Valencia had told me, I still loved him. Deep down, I believed that true love could conquer all obstacles, that no evil lived in him, and our love would win out in the end. I still watched him closely, searching for proof that he was a Rasky. Valencia was convinced and had told me to look for changing eye color, vocal oddities, or strange smells. He kept smiling at me, and I couldn't help but smile back. There were no changes to his handsome face as we walked down the drive, and I was beginning to doubt Valencia's sanity, as well as everything she had taught me. I wanted to be a normal teenager. I wanted to go to school next year as Blade's girlfriend and lead a normal life. I didn't want to be an apprentice to my crazy great-grandmother. I was dreaming of a normal, witch-free life when we reached Blade's house. The brick monstrosity loomed before us, and for a moment the sky darkened ominously. A cold wind swept over us and left goosebumps on my arms. Blade just smiled at me. The sun was on his face, and his eyes looked red for a moment, orangey red, as if his irises were on fire. It was gone in a fraction of a second, and I couldn't be sure if it had really happened, or if Valencia's paranoia was rubbing off on me. I wanted so much to believe that Blade was just a boy, not some ancient evil out to destroy me. Blade's mother opened the door as we approached. She was thin and brown from the hours she spent gardening in the hot summer sun. She was dressed for working in her garden, but dropped her gloves to shake my hand and welcome me into their home. We went into the kitchen, where she poured us 2 large glasses of lemonade. I thought about the apple wine Blade brought to the maze as we drank. The lemonade was cool and sweet. Blade's mom smiled at me, and I was suddenly aware of the deep silence that filled the house. Blade seemed to notice it too. He set his glass down a little harder than he should have, making his mother and I jump at the sound. "Where's Evelyn?" His mother looked nervous. She seemed to shrink as she focused her attention on stirring the ice cubes in her glass. "I'm not sure. She went out to play an hour ago, and hasn't come back yet." Blade sighed. "Well, I guess she'll have to meet Casey some other time." "It's probably for the best. She was cranky this morning. I don't think she slept well last night. The storm was so loud." She looked at me for a response, and I managed to agree that it had been very loud. though I had no idea what she was talking about. I hadn't heard a storm. She smiled a small, sad smile and excused herself, telling us to have fun and help ourselves to anything we wanted in the kitchen. She went out to her garden, pulling on her floral print gloves and placing the large straw hat atop her curly head. As the door banged shut behind her, I turned to Blade in astonishment. "Isn't she worried?" "Who?" He looked confused, as if I had suddenly started speaking a different language. "Your mom. She hasn't seen your sister in an hour, but she doesn't seem worried." "Oh, Evelyn does this all the time. When she's upset, it's better to just leave her alone until she decides to come back." "But she's 6. You don't leave a 6-year-old alone." Blade sighed again. "Trust me, Casey. It's not a big deal. Evelyn will be back this afternoon, safe and sound." I didn't say anything else about it. Blade seemed so tired as he talked about his sister, and I wanted him to go back to the happy, carefree mood he'd been in before. He gave me a tour of their house. It was old, built in the mid-1800s, each brick laid by the hands of the farmers who had once lived there. There were strange little half-walls in some of the rooms, and most of the ancient wooden doors were warped out of shape and didn't fit their frames any longer. 2 doors on the second floor had been replaced. Their smooth, dark wood looked stranger than any of the older oddities in the house. Behind one of the new doors was Blade's room. I was giddy as I entered it. My heart raced with excitement, and my palms were clammy with sweat. The room was a bit of a disappointment. The walls were painted light beige and empty. A dark green throw rug covered the polished blonde wood floor. His bed was covered in a comforter of the same dark green, and the pillows matched the walls. Everything was neatly arranged on the shelves placed on either side of his bed. They mostly held books with the spines turned to face the wall. I went to them and touched one lightly. "Please don't." Blade's voice was angry, and I pulled my hand back in surprise. When I looked at him, he just smiled and lifted the dark green curtain that covered the huge windows on the northern wall. "Check out the view." The windows covered the entire wall and looked out on the intersection of the road and my driveway. The view from his room was breathtaking. In the distance, the tops of the buildings in town were visible, peeking just above the treetops and aided by the land sloping away from the house into the valley where the town was built along the river. Movement on the lawn below drew my attention, and I saw Blade's mother standing at the edge of the road, staring in the direction of my house. Her mouth was slack, and her eyes rolled up in her head. Her body stiffened, and her arms shot up into the air. As she began convulsing, I screamed and started for the door, but Blade blocked my way. "Don't go out there." "We need to help her. What's wrong with you?" "She'll be fine. This happens all the time. Trust me. Go look again." His fingers dug painfully into my arm as he led me back to the window. I didn't want to look. The sight of her possessed and shaking had frightened me. But Blade pulled back the curtain and shoved me forward. My arm ached where his fingers had been, and I rubbed the spot as I cautiously approached the window. I looked out, expecting to see his mother lying dead on the road, but she was kneeling next to their mailbox, cutting the tall grass around the post. She stood up and wiped the sweat from her brow and waved when she saw us watching. She was smiling and looked completely normal. I turned back to Blade, but he was sitting on his bed, seemingly absorbed by the leaf pattern of his comforter. I didn't know what to say. As the tense, silent moments passed, I thought about just asking him outright if he was a Rasky, but quickly banished the idea. I couldn't risk it. If he was, he would know I'd started my training, and I would probably be killed. If he wasn't a Rasky, well, I probably wouldn't see him again. I sat down on the bed. He absently took my hand, and we sat looking into each other's eyes in silence. He kissed me suddenly, and my heart felt like it would pound out of my chest. He pulled away swiftly a moment later and dropped my hand as he stood up. "It's too hot. Let's get out of here. The backyard is much cooler." I followed him reluctantly down the stairs, through the kitchen, and out the back door. We stepped out into a cool green paradise. Compared to the opulence of my backyard, it was refreshingly simple. A large green lawn, perfectly trimmed, stretched out like a carpet, running right up to the edge of the forest. Directly behind the house was a thick grove of cool and fragrant pine trees. I inhaled deeply and sighed. There was some kind of power in those trees. I could feel it the moment we stepped outside, and I longed to go and explore, but Blade threw himself down on the grass and patted the spot beside him. There was a good energy around us, something invigorating and new. As I watched Blade, lounging with the sun on his peaceful face, I once again doubted Valencia's sanity. This place seemed safe and devoid of anything dangerous or dark. Blade and his mother were odd, but they didn't seem evil. We spent the next few hours basking in the sun. Blade's mom brought us some homemade cookies, still warm from the oven with the chocolate melting inside. I felt sad as I ate them. This was the kind of life I had always wanted. A comfortable and loving family with a mom who made cookies and gardened while wearing ridiculous hats. Valencia hadn't done those things. She'd always had her ancient facade, and my childhood had been cold and lonely. She loved me, and there were moments of tenderness, but it was a weak replacement for the love of a mother, something I barely remembered, but greatly desired. Blade wouldn't go near the pine forest. I really wanted to explore the winding trails, but he adamantly refused. He grew agitated and said he found it creepy. He claimed it smelled bad, like something was rotting somewhere nearby. I couldn't believe it. The forest smelled wonderful and fresh, and I wanted to explore its shady depths. I said nothing about it, forcing a smile and dropping the issue as quickly as I could, but my eyes were constantly drawn toward those trees. I kept waiting for Blade's sister, and was certain she would come bouncing around the corner at any moment. I couldn't imagine a 6-year-old being left to wander on her own for so long, but neither Blade nor his mom seemed to give it a passing thought. We had a lavish picnic lunch on the back lawn, but still no Evelyn. After lunch, Blade suggested we walk back to my house and wander around the maze again. I wasn't sure I wanted to go back there, but I agreed. Blade's mom hugged me when we said goodbye. She looked sad. Her face changed briefly to something resembling panic, as she reminded Blade to be back in time to watch his sister that afternoon. As we rounded the corner, the house came into view. Valencia was hobbling toward us. She stumbled and sprawled onto the dirt. We rushed to her. Blade took her arm and lifted her to her feet. She winced in pain when he touched her, but he didn't notice. Her face was turned toward me, and through the greasy tangles of her hair, I saw tears in her eyes. "What a nice young man you are, Blade." "Are you all right, Mrs. Valdala?" "I feel a little off. Perhaps I should go lie down. Casey, will you help me?" "Of course." Blade left us at the front steps and went home while I tended to Valencia. I was secretly relieved to see him go. Valencia leaned heavily on me as we walked into the house. I thought it was part of her act, but when the door closed behind us, she dropped onto a chair and started to cry. I was terrified. She clutched her arm where he had touched her and bawled like a child. I sat watching in stunned silence, unable to move or speak. When the pain lessened, she told me to bring her a bottle from the hidden room. The slender green vial was filled with a pale yellow liquid that smelled like lavender. Valencia didn't speak while she bathed her arm, wincing a little less each time she touched the affected area. When she was finished, she handed the bottle to me. Her eyes were red and watery. "Help me to the room. There is much to be done, and we cannot wait any longer." She would say nothing more until we were safely locked in the hidden room. Even then, she hesitated, searching for the right words. I was impatient and unable to sit still. I paced around the room, examining the many bottles and pouches that littered the shelves. Tucked amongst them were other odd objects, coated in dust and untouched for many, many years. One of these was a small silver case. Valencia took it from the shelf and rubbed the dust away, revealing an intricately engraved cover, and in the center was the name Clara. "This was your mother's," Valencia said, handing the case to me before settling into her chair. "I gave it to her when she was a child, for at that time she was the last of the witches of Norg Hollow." Valencia's voice broke, and I looked up from the carvings to see that she was crying quietly. Her shoulders shook, but when I tried to comfort her, she put up her hand and told me to sit down. Already the tears were drying on her face. "Don't worry about me. I will be fine. I miss your mother very much, but there is no time for that right now. I waited too long before, and she died as a result. I cannot allow that to happen to you. I promised Clara I would keep you safe, and I shall." Another long moment of silence passed before she continued. In that case is a powerful amulet. It once belonged to the king of the Raskies. It is the source of his godlike powers. The witch who succeeded in splitting him took it as a souvenir, without any idea of what it truly was. Little was known about the Raskies and their magic at that time. Our knowledge came later, after much research and experimentation. Use it wisely, and it will keep you safe in the trials to come. But Casey, be very careful about when and where you use it. The amulet has its own powers. It will call forth many creatures, only told of in folklore and children's tales. Do not be fooled into thinking you can control it, for you do not. There is only one who can, and he must never return. What trials are you talking about? What's going to happen to me? Valencia sighed. She passed her hand over her face, brushing away a fresh batch of tears. I fear that you will be the deciding factor in an ancient feud. The witches of Norg Hollow and the Raskies were at war for centuries before the fall of their leader. Our powers waned afterward, and many witches began to leave for other lands. The Raskies were in hiding, and many believed they were gone for good. Norg Hollow slowly drifted into shadow, and our once great powers weakened. At that time, just before Norg Hollow was lost, a great witch made a prophecy that one day when we were all but destroyed, a young witch, the last witch, would meet the great Rasky in battle, and having defeated him, she would sail south to find Norg Hollow and renew the powers that have been lost. We all thought she had gone mad at the time. Even with our diminished powers, we were certain that Norg Hollow could not be lost, and that we would endure and return from our journeys refreshed and invigorated. No one planned to leave forever. Our travels were to be merely exploration, the gathering of information about the other lands to help us better understand the world and our place in it. She looked at me keenly. Her face was a mask of pain and regret. I could see the lands of Norg Hollow in my mind, the flowing rivers, the lush grassy hills, the flat fertile plains, and the towering mountains. I could see Valencia as she had once been, young and beautiful with power emanating from her fingertips. I felt a strong desire to go there, like it was the home I had been searching for my entire life. The witches never left Norg Hollow before that time. A few had been banished for disobeying the rules, but none had ever left of their own will. We split up and traveled to different times and lands, for Norg Hollow is a place beyond time as this world knows it. No one ever returned. We would occasionally find each other in this world, but the meetings were rare and grew even more so as the witches began meeting their fate. Now is the time of the prophecy. You are the last, and the great Rasky has found you. I wish it could have been later, after you had a chance to learn more magic, but perhaps it is better this way. Why are you so worried? The prophecy says I win. The fate of things is never certain, and the prophecy was made long ago. Any event in the last few centuries could have changed it. It is up to you. I believe you can do it. You're strong and stubborn, like I was at your age. I hope it is so. I hope you get to see Norg Hollow, the place that is always on my mind in the day and haunts my dreams at night. How I would love to see it one more time. I'll take you with me. You have to come. How will I know how to find it? I'm afraid I won't be there to help you, Casey. You'll have to find it on your own. You must be the last witch, and my end is coming. I have felt it since the arrival of your friend, and today, when he touched me, I knew it was true. Fear and sadness swept over me, and I fell into Valencia's open arms, burying my face in her shoulder. She rubbed my back and spoke quiet, loving words to me until I calmed down. After years of living together, this was our closest moment, and I regretted the lost time greatly. Time is precious now. We cannot waste a single second. I want you to be as prepared as possible before it begins. Before what begins? Many years ago, Not long after I escaped from Sparks, another witch came to Crystal River. Her name was Ameda. She was an elderly witch before we left the island, and she was standing on the brink of death. I could see its shadow hanging over her as she stood on the front steps, holding a velvet-wrapped package. It was the amulet. She brought it to me because I was the only other witch she could find. She knew her time had come, and she had searched the world for someone to watch over the amulet. She died as she walked away, just fading into the failing light of dusk until she was no more. I began having strange dreams. The mighty witches of my past came to me and told me that the final witch of Norg Hollow would be my kin. I thought then that it would be my daughter, but that part of the dream was always hazy. That was when I built the maze behind the house. I don't know why I did it, but at the time I believed it was necessary. I think it will have something to do with the final trials, but I am not sure how. For now we can only prepare for whatever may befall you. Come, we have talked too long. We need to get to work. We spent the rest of the day poring over books of spells and potions and charms, trying to decide which ones were important and which ones could be left for later. I have to admit my thoughts were not completely on the work at hand. I tried to focus, but Valencia's impending death troubled me. Blade was in my thoughts as well, not as my enemy, but as an object of desire. I couldn't help but love him. He was my first crush, my first kiss, my first boyfriend. I didn't want to fight him, or whatever it was I was supposed to do, and I kept wondering what would happen if I refused. Chapter 6. The next morning I officially met Evelyn. She was a sweet girl, though extremely spoiled. Both Blade and his mother gave in to her every whim, and it was quickly apparent that she disliked anyone new joining their cozy group. She stayed close to Blade while I was introduced. Mrs. Connor fled the room soon after my arrival, stopping long enough to take my hand and welcome me before disappearing into the kitchen. The smell of fresh-baked cinnamon buns wafted through the air and made my mouth water. Evelyn watched me silently, and I waited for her to tell Blade of our previous encounter in the woods. She did not speak, but suddenly began crying and screaming at the top of her lungs. Blade and I both jumped at the sudden change, and he hurried to lift her up and cuddle her, stroking her smooth hair and speaking soothingly to her. When he asked her what was wrong, she raised a small, pudgy finger and pointed at me. "She's a witch. She's going to steal me when I'm asleep and make soup from my bones." Blade smiled at me over her head while he explained that I was not a witch. Evelyn did not look convinced and eyed me warily. I wondered what had happened to the sugar-sweet girl I'd met before, and decided that maybe Evelyn had not slept well again, and it would be best to leave her alone. Mrs. Connor entered the room, carrying a tray laden with the biggest cinnamon buns I had ever seen. They were dripping with frosting and sprinkled lightly with brown sugar. She placed the tray before us, serving the first beautiful bun to Evelyn, who took a big bite, chewed thoughtfully, and opened her mouth to show me. "Evelyn, honey, please, don't be rude to our guest." Mrs. Connor's voice was hesitant. Her words hung in the silence that followed. Evelyn glared at her mother, took another big bite, and repeated her lovely performance. Blade gave her a sharp look, and her mouth snapped shut. She chewed sullenly before flinging the rest of her cinnamon bun across the room. It hit the wall with a soft thud and stuck there, defying gravity through the sheer will of its delicious, sticky frosting. Mrs. Connor said nothing. She did not punish Evelyn for what she had done, but silently pulled the bun off the wall and scraped away the icing from the pale yellow paint. Blade was looking at his hands clenched in his lap. His knuckles were white, and his hands shook. Mrs. Connor quietly left, burying the remains of her masterpiece, and Evelyn reached for another sticky bun. She sat happily eating and humming to herself while Blade and I watched her. She took no notice of us, and I saw a look of panic cross Blade's face. After some time, she turned her sticky face to me and offered the plate. "Cinnamon bun?" She grinned, looking more like the precocious little girl from the forest. I took one and tentatively bit into it. The wonderful flavor was overshadowed by the girl's face. She was still smiling, with sweetness oozing from her very being, but in her eyes was an unmistakable look of hatred. Blade took a cinnamon bun, and we began chatting as if nothing had happened. He seemed embarrassed and eager to please his sister. He told her jokes that made her giggle uncontrollably. I smiled, seeing him be so kind and gentle with her, and Evelyn, seeing this, cut her laughter short. Silence filled the house, a heavy silence that caused Mrs. Connor to enter quickly from the kitchen. Seeing that everyone was fine, she exited just as quickly, and we could hear the sound of a spoon rattling against a pan as she worked on her next culinary masterpiece. Evelyn gave me a haughty look, then announced, "I want to play Sweet Adventure." Sweet Adventure was a boring board game designed for small children still learning their colors and unable to deal with the complexities of a game with dice. I had loved that game as a little girl. It was one of the only things I remembered from my childhood, before I came to live with Valencia. I remembered sitting on my mother's lap, her hair tickling my cheek as she leaned forward to move her brightly colored game piece. I remember the sense of joy I got when I pulled one of the special cards, the cards with different characters on them instead of just a color. I smiled at Evelyn's childlike desire, and I was about to offer to join her in a game when Blade shook his head. "Not today, Evelyn." His voice was soft. Evelyn pouted briefly, crossing her arms and sticking out her lower lip as far as it would go. I smiled at her again. "Maybe some other time, Evelyn." She dropped her arms and grinned happily. "Okay, I want a story instead." Blade sighed. "Not right now, Evie. I'll tell you a story later after Casey goes home. We were going to go explore the woods some more. I'll bring you back some wild strawberries." Evelyn pouted again and began slamming her tiny fists into her lap. "No, I want a story. I want a story now." Blade threw his hands in the air. "Fine, I'll tell you one story, and then Casey and I are leaving." "No, Mommy needs to tell the story. I want my special story." "No, Evie, not today. Casey doesn't want to hear the special story." "I wouldn't mind," I offered. Blade shot me an irritated look while Evelyn began jumping up and down. "Story, story, story!" He gave Evelyn a strange, warning glance, to which she smiled sweetly and continued jumping. He looked at me. "I'll be right back." He slowly exited the room, turning to give us one last worried look before entering the kitchen. Evelyn immediately stopped jumping. The smile vanished, and she came right up to me and stood with her tiny, angry face just inches from my own. "My brother likes you, but I don't. I know what you are. And I have something to tell you. Blade isn't what you think he is, so leave him alone." She spit in my face, then hurried back to her seat as Blade and Mrs. Connor entered the room. I wiped the spit from my cheek. Mrs. Connor didn't see it. Her eyes were fixed solidly on the floor as she moved slowly toward us. She seemed afraid, as if she was going before a firing squad. The woman was absolutely terrified to tell her little girl a story. Blade saw the spit, and I saw him shoot a look at Evelyn, lifting his eyebrows and giving her a serious stare. She smiled innocently back and clasped her hands in her lap. Mrs. Connor sat down slowly, her eyes lifted slightly, just landing on my face before quickly dropping back to the floor. She stiffened as Evelyn crawled into her lap. She held her daughter awkwardly, as if unused to such displays of affection. Evelyn did not seem to notice her mother's discomfort and looked up sweetly. "I want to hear the special story, Mama. My favorite story." Mrs. Connor sighed. "All right, Evie, I'll tell the special story, although I hope Casey can forgive me if she does not enjoy it as much as you do." She gave me a sad, apologetic look, and I assured her that I would enjoy hearing the story. "I doubt that, but here goes. Once upon a time, there was a powerful but lonely man named Bentley Dale. He lived not far from here and was the wealthiest man in town. His wife and children had died of a terrible sickness many years before, and he lived a solitary life in his great house atop the highest hill. During one of his rare trips into town, he met a beautiful young woman. She had just arrived from a strange country far beyond the borders of the town and was looking for a place to stay. He fell desperately in love with her. He offered her a room in his grand house, and she accepted. He was the happiest he had ever been, and the townspeople were happy for him, as well as for themselves, for he became more social and brought his new love to town often to spend exorbitant amounts of money in the local shops. The town was growing rich, and they praised the arrival of the strange young woman. After some time, the townspeople began to notice peculiar things. Strange colored lights would fill the sky around the great house on the hill. Heavy smokes emanated from the chimneys and would hang over the town for days before dissipating. The most disturbing of all were the strange people that began to visit the house in the middle of the night. The townspeople began locking their doors, and several of the men would stand guard each night as the odd and often disfigured beings drifted past their homes and up the hill. No one ever saw them leave, and rumors began to spread that Bentley's new love was a witch. Just like your grandma, Casey, Evelyn interjected. Blade shot Evelyn an angry look, but Mrs. Connor just sighed and continued. Bentley vanished. He was never seen in town again. Months passed, and the townspeople were convinced that he had been killed by one of the witch's strange visitors. They gathered one afternoon for a town meeting and decided to drive this odd woman and any of her strange friends that remained away from their town. They wanted to feel safe again, and many of their businesses were suffering because fear kept people in their homes. The mob armed themselves with torches and knives and pitchforks and guns, anything they could find, and they ascended the hill as night fell. The night was still and dark. The moon was hiding, and the light from the torches made strange shadows. Some turned back, returning to their homes and locking their doors behind them. But many continued up to the house. They broke down the door and rushed in. The house was dark, and in their terror, they began slashing and killing anything in their path. Bentley rushed forth to stop them and was quickly cut down. Many townspeople also died, mistakenly attacked by a friend or neighbor. Their blind slaughter continued until two things stopped them in their tracks. The first was the sound of a high, terrible laughter. The townspeople that rushed outside saw the strange woman flying through the sky without even the aid of a broom and disappearing into the night. The second sound was a child crying. Inside the great house, bent over the body of Bentley Dale, was a small girl. She looked at the townspeople, her eyes filling with tears and rage, and she began screaming. The sound was unearthly, shattering windows and driving the people out of the house and back into their homes. Even behind locked doors, they couldn't escape the sound, and it continued for days before finally ceasing. The townspeople emerged tentatively from their homes and looked up the hill. The house was burning. The raging inferno consumed the building in minutes, leaving nothing but a pile of ash. The child walked down into the town, scattering people as she passed, and was never seen there again. Those who saw her pass lost their sight. She was said to be the product of the witch woman and one of the dark, misshapen men that had often visited the house. Stories of the child's dark and evil manner ran rampant through the town. Other tales soon emerged, implicating the witch and the child in the theft of the rare and most valuable of Bentley's possessions. During the mad attack on Bentley and his home, thieves had attempted to find the treasure, a collection of bright-colored jewels from the Nakai Desert. They were rumored to possess a powerful magic. Bentley Dale had acquired them during one of his trips to the Naran region, and had displayed them for the entire town to see after his return. Those that saw the jewels of Nakai could never banish the thought of them from their minds, and some became obsessed. After a few attempts had been made to steal them, Bentley hid them in a vault deep within the mansion, and they were never seen by the townspeople again. Stories of the jewels surfaced after the child's departure. She was seen accompanied by the witch, carrying a golden bag. Many had attempted to steal that beautiful bag, but the jewels that lay inside drove them mad. The duo made their way across the country, followed by tales of their great powers and evil possessions. The witch carried only a large book, bound in some kind of hide. It was said to contain a piece of Bentley Dale's soul, and would speak to the people that were curious enough to touch it. It spoke in Bentley's voice, and bore the name he had been called in his childhood, Dumavine. The witch and the child brought pain and misery to every place they visited, and were soon considered a threat to the safety of good, common people. They were hunted and driven away from every town they approached, and soon vanished from daily life, leaving behind only the tale of the downfall of Bentley Dale. Mrs. Connor fell silent, and Evelyn applauded. I sat in a state of shock upon hearing the name of the book, the same one in Valencia's library, the one that opened the passage to the hidden room. I could feel Blade's eyes on me, but I couldn't look at him. Doubts were creeping into my mind, and I just wanted to go home and think. Evelyn stood in front of me, her hands on her hips, and smiling. Did you like the story? I nodded. It's my favorite. Do you know why? I shook my head. I still did not trust my voice. Evelyn smiled wider. Because the witch got what she deserved in the end. All witches should be hunted and forced into hiding. Even your grandma. I sat mutely as she skipped out of the room. Mrs. Connor sighed heavily, and without looking at me or apologizing for her daughter's behavior, stood and went quickly back into the kitchen. Blade and I sat in silence. I kept my eyes on my hands, which were clasped tightly in my lap, but I knew he was staring at me. The silence became uncomfortable. From the floor above, I could hear Evelyn singing. Finally, I stood up. I need to go. I don't feel very well. I hope Evelyn didn't upset you. She can be kind of a pain sometimes. Mom's not a very good disciplinarian, and Evie only listens to me when she feels like it. She can be kind of mean. I wouldn't worry about what she said about your grandma. She gets carried away with that story. I don't know why it's her favorite. Blade's voice was gentle and apologetic. He kissed me lightly before I left and offered to walk me home. I declined and started up the drive. I could feel him watching me until I rounded the corner. Even after I was out of sight, I had the feeling he was still watching, and I ran the rest of the way to the house. When I got home, I locked myself in my room and cried. I didn't speak to Valencia. She only came to my room once to ask me if I was okay, and then left me alone. I heard her go back to the secret room, where she stayed for a long time. I had always wondered what she did there, but now my curiosity would not be silenced, and I tiptoed into the library. The book was in its usual place, but I hesitated before touching it. The name Dumavine was all my eyes could see. As I stared at the letters, they grew dark and began to shift and change shape. 2 eyes stared back at me from the spine of the book, and I stumbled backward. They watched me, blinking occasionally, but nothing else happened. As I reached again for the book, I heard the soft click of the secret door, and I hurried from the room. Getting the book was going to be more difficult than I had anticipated. Valencia was more guarded than usual. We ate lunch in silence. I could tell she wanted to ask me about my visit to Blade's house, but was waiting to see what I would offer up on my own. I focused on eating as quickly as possible and left the table as soon as I was finished. I went out into the warm afternoon sunshine. Summer was almost over and school would soon begin. Already the first leaves were beginning to change, and little patches of red peeked out from amidst the green. I walked around the house, past the jutting additions and into the backyard. The maze rose up before me, taller and more menacing than I remembered. I thought about my trip into it with Blade, and the strange things that had been happening ever since he came into my life. I was suddenly certain that I was being watched, and I looked up in time to see the curtain on the library window fall back into place. I quickly left the backyard, ducking into the forest and running through the trees. I didn't think about where I was going. I just ran. All I wanted to do was get as far as possible from the house and Valencia, as if putting a small amount of distance between us could save me from the strange fate she had brought upon me. Without thinking, I veered off the main path and soon found myself at the cave. We hadn't been there in a while, but very little had changed. Some long, mossy strands had fallen over the opening. They hung down from the trees above and rippled in the cold wind that continued to issue forth from the cave. I shivered but moved closer, determined to finally enter its dark depths. The wind blew stronger and howled in my ears, but I pushed back the moss and stepped inside. The darkness surrounded me, and the wind vanished. A heavy silence was all around me, and I barely dared to breathe. I took a few tentative steps. The path went steeply down, far below the earth, and I followed it, moving slowly, shuffling my feet, and keeping one hand on the wall. It grew colder the deeper I went, but the darkness was lessened by the dim outline of a door. Thin lines of light cut through the blackness. I ran my hand over it. The door was ragged and warped. The wood was old and swollen from the dampness of the tunnel, and it was rented with holes from thousands of hungry insects. My hands found the doorknob, but I hesitated, feeling the rusty metal under my fingers, and afraid of what was on the other side. I turned the knob slowly, and there was a loud click that echoed off the walls of the tunnel and made me jump. I waited. There was no sound from the other side, and slowly, I pushed the door open.